In this video, we'll look at designing a class to represent a button in a graphics window, since many programs have a need for a button. Here are the requirements for our button, which is slightly different than the one in the book. Display it as text with a rectangle around the text. Specify the center of the button and width and height of it. Be able to get or change the text. Enable or display the button. We want to draw it differently to indicate the state. And check if a point is inside the button for checking if it is clicked. When the button is disabled, this method should return false. Here is a drawing of what we want it to look like. Using the graphics class to draw the rectangle and text, here is a reasonable set of instance variables and methods. We will store the rectangle so we can change how it is drawn. We need the text object so we can get and set the text. The rectangle class may have a way to get the location of it, but we will store them in a convenient form so we can check if a point is inside the rectangle. We will also use an instance variable to indicate whether the button is currently enabled or disabled. Here are the methods we need to meet the requirements: a constructor, a method to get the label, a method to set the label, a method to check if a point is inside the rectangle, a method to enable the button, and a method to disable the button. We'll now open PyCharm and add each method and put pass as the initial statement for each one. We'll also add documentation strings so that as we write each method, we can refer to it and make certain the method does everything it needs to do. We'll start by writing the constructor. We passed all the information needed to create the button, but not all these need to be instance variables. Since we have the center point, we need to compute the boundaries of the rectangle. Those will be half the width and height from the center point, so we'll compute those lengths. We'll also need to access the coordinates of the center, so we'll make temporary variables to hold those. Note that none of these values need to be instance variables, as we will just use them to compute the rectangle's coordinates. We do need the boundaries to check if a point is inside the rectangle, so we'll save those as instance variables. We'll make the 2 points for the rectangle. We do not need to save the points as instance variables, since they are just being used to create the rectangle, and we have the boundaries stored in instance variables. We do want to save the rectangle as an instance variable, so we can change how it is drawn depending on whether the button is enabled or disabled. We also want the text object containing the label to be an instance variable, so we can change how the label looks depending on whether the button is enabled or disabled, and change the text. We'll call the disable method so the button is initially disabled. We also set the enabled instance variable in that method, even though PyCharm warns us about initializing it outside the constructor. Since the constructor calls the disable method, we will ignore the warning. The clicked method is relatively straightforward. We make certain the button is enabled, and the point we pass is inside the rectangle. For a point to be inside the rectangle, the x-coordinate must be between the min and max x values of the rectangle, and the y-coordinate must be between the min and max y values. Since we have the boundaries as instance variables, and this syntax for checking if a value is between two variables works in Python, we can do this with 3 Boolean expressions ANDed together. If you remember De Morgan's law, the negation of this changes the ands to ors, and we negate each expression so this method will return false if the button is not enabled, or either the x-coordinate or y-coordinate of the click is not inside the boundaries. The getLabel and setLabel methods use the text object we created inside the constructor and saved as an instance variable to get or set the label for the text object inside the rectangle. In the setLabel method, note that the parameter label is of type string, but the self.label instance variable is of type text, and text objects have a setText method. This should reinforce the concept that instance variables and local variables are separate variables and do not need to be the same type, even though if they share the same name, they often represent the same thing. The enable and disable methods change the appearance and set the enabled instance variable. Since these methods change the appearance of the rectangle and text object, the rectangle and text object needed to be instance variables. The other thing to note is the difference between documentation strings and comments. Documentation strings are for the person using the class, so they explain what the method does. Comments are for the person who may need to maintain the code and modify it, so they explain how a method works. The person using the class does not need to know the internal details of how it works that are in the comments, but they do need the information provided in the documentation string. We'll use the button class along with another class in the next video.